Great. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Eric Salobir, the president of the Human Technology Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this panel on behalf of the foundation. Last July, we had a first webcast on responsible AI. It was moderated by Charles Morgan and focused on the regulator's perspective. Killian Gross, responsible for drafting the European Union AI regulation project, explained the Brussels point of view. Nye Thomas from the Ontario Law Commission and Alpesh Shah from IEEE presented two different Northern American approaches. If you missed this event, you can watch it on replay on the website of the Human Technology Foundation. Today, our goal is to focus on the impact on companies, on their practices, and on their business models, how to implement a trustworthy AI, how to deal with a new regulatory framework. To address these questions, we have chosen to give the floor to three high-level experts representing very different business sectors. IKEA for retail, but also home automation and personal services, Telecom Italia for telephony, IT, and cloud computing, and Partech for investment and finance. As a moderator, we have the privilege to have Cathy Cobey, Global Leader for Responsible AI at EY Ernst & Young. She will introduce our panelists. Cathy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. What I thought I'd maybe do first just is to give a bit of an overview, because I don't know with the group we have on the call today, what everyone's understanding is about the new European Union draft AI regulation. So I just thought I'd take a couple of minutes before we get into the panelist conversation, just to give you a bit of some of what I think some of the key attributes of the draft regulation are. The first, I think, is what I think is quite impactful is the intent to categorize AI systems and models. And the regulation currently right now has identified these four categories, and they are, defined by risk. So there is further information within the regulation as to how to categorize a system between these different risk categories. But you can see it starts at the lowest risk. And, from there, it's basically fairly open in regards to use. You can be, permitted to use those low risk or minimal risk AI systems without really any restrictions. And then you move to the moderate risk. And that's when you start to, through the regulation, organizations are subjected to some expectations around the creation of controls and governance. And then you move into the higher risk category, which is going to have the highest level of governance and controls expected, with conformity assessments required. And within the regulations, there's some examples of what the writers of the draft regulation expected should be included in each category. And then there's a last one, which is basically ones that are considered unacceptable risk. They are of such high risk that they actually shouldn't even be permitted for use. So I think it's important because some of the questions I'm going to ask the panelists are going to kind of be driven based on the, first of all, defining what AI is, but then also the task of categorizing it into these four categories. When you then start thinking about exactly what then are some of the expectations that would be required, there's quite a many, and I'm not going to get into all of them today and this morning, but there are a couple that I wanted to mention. The first is that there is an expectation that this isn't just going to be a kind of a one and done exercise, that you do it before you put in an AI system into production, but that you continue to evaluate it, and that it be evaluated against a number of different criteria. One is the intended purpose, what was the objectives and the original expectations for the AI system, but also what are the public expectations and regulatory expectations. It is intended that you would do a conformity assessment against the requirements, and that will be driven based on the risk assessment. And then once it's in production, that you will continually be monitoring it. You'll be looking at the data that it's feeding it and the outcomes that it's producing, and how it's impacting the different stakeholders. You also need to have a robust incident management system so that if any concerns are raised, whether through observers or overseers of the system or from the users of it, that those can actually be addressed on a very timely basis, and any required actions are taken. And then the last is the expectation that you will have criteria to determine when you should be thinking about doing a new conformity assessment. So has something changed to the point where you actually do need to kind of redo the conformity assessment, and that may actually impact the risk level or the, you know, the different expectations that are required. So that's a very high level overview because I don't want to spend too much time actually talking about the regulation. So what I'd like to do maybe is have each of our panelists introduce themselves so that they can actually not only say who they are, but also what relevance this regulation really has to their day-to-day interaction. So Romain, I see that you are open and your mic is on, so why don't we start with you?
I'm starting, sorry.
Yes, if you could go.
Yeah. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So Romain Lavault, I'm a partner at Partech, who is a relatively old venture capital firm, started in 1982 in San Francisco, now active across 4 continents, 26 countries exactly. I'm a former AI entrepreneur myself, so I was funded by Partech in the previous decade. And for the last 9 years, I joined the other side of the table, and I now contribute to funding this whole new generation of entrepreneurs. Interestingly, and it's not going to be a surprise for you, AI is very top of mind for investors like we are. I think most people don't know the numbers, but there are about 800 unicorns in the world today. Unicorns are like billion-dollar startups and more. This has been growing very fast in the last 12 months in particular. Out of those 800, 180 are AI startups. So almost 1 unicorn out of 3 is an AI startup. So this is huge. In total, they represent, those 180, they represent $1.3 trillion of enterprise value. And it's growing 2x per year. So it's massive. The majority is, of course, in the US and in China. But interestingly, and that is probably why we have this regulation in Europe coming in, the share of Europe is increasing very fast. There was $50 billion invested in AI last year, of which 8 was in Europe. This year, it's predicted to be 75 globally, so 50% growth. But we're doubling the share in Europe, so it's going to be more than 16, probably $17 billion in euros, sorry, in Europe. So this is really becoming top of mind, and all startups are saying they use AI to some extent. If you remember, in 2010, all startups were about cloud. In 2015, all startups were about big data, whether they were doing it or not, sometimes just an Excel file with big data. And it's the same thing about AI. Everyone claims they do AI, and as we'll probably discuss later, AI is a very generic term. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Nozha, why don't you go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to share this discussion with you. So I spent quite a number of years in academia research in computer science and applied math, and headed quite a number of teams in data science and software engineering, and later on headed the research center at INRIA in France, and founded the first interdisciplinary institute in AI in France, which is called Data. The most connected, let's say, activity in my previous career is that I was the vice chair of the high-level expert group on AI of the European Commission, in charge of this report, Ethical Guideline for Trustworthy AI. And also I participated and coordinate the Trustworthy AI Principles into the OECD working group on AI system, and also currently member of the OECD network of experts in AI, and mostly involved in the working group dealing with moving from principles into action. And after that activity, in fact, I joined a company in health and AI, And we can, in fact, understand that this regulation is very much inspired by what is happening in the health sector. And now, more recently, I mean, quite a number of months now, I joined this year IKEA Retail Ingka Group as digital ethics and responsible AI director at the global level. And we are really, in fact, while you know, our digital transformation is happening, and we are making this digital transformation responsible by design from the AI perspective, but in more generally in the use of data and algorithm in a responsible way and a beneficial way. And in our company, we are considering three, in fact, not only customer, but also coworker data and third-party, you know, business partners, supplier ecosystem. So we are really considering the responsibility of our tech services for all, you know, not only customers. So for the co-worker perspective, there is plenty of things that are in connection with maybe I should stop here in terms of presentation, okay? Let's keep the other points for the discussion.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll definitely get into some of those more deeper points. Alfredo, do you want to go last and introduce yourself?
Sure, Cathy. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Alfredo Noovle. In Noovle, that is the cloud company of TIM. TIM is a telco operator here in Italy. I'm responsible of portfolio, center of excellence, and marketing initiative. You know, in my career, I always approach the problem related to AI machine learning in the last 4 years before joining Noovle from the infrastructure perspective. So providing the infrastructure and solution to enable the AI and ML adoption, you know, how to deal with data and this kind of things. Once I joined Noovle, I have in my portfolio different elements of AI offering. Not just the usage of AI within my products, but also we provide AI solution to the customer. So the problem of responsibility and accountabilities and everything related to the classification of AI for us is key, because we provide such service, you know, directly to our customer. As a second point, from my experience, you asked Cathy to share the experience about regulation in our job. I'm also responsible of the adoption of the new ISV startup or initiative that are interested in dealing with a cloud provider and provide the use cases and new behavior to our customer. And as Romain was pointed before, you know, 85% of those guys are using or providing or enabling AI and ML solutions. So we have I have two kind of responsibility: focus on what I provide, but also apply some trust and risk assessment to the filter of the ISV that I need to onboard to provide value to my portfolio.
That's great, thank you. And I think everyone can see that we've got, you know, a really diverse, you know, perspectives on the panel today. So really excited to kind of jump into, you know, some of the questions we'll talk about. So maybe Nozha, I'll start with you, because I think with the background that you gave us, really clear that you've been, you know, really contemplating the rollout of responsible and trusted AI for many years and have worked across with a lot of different stakeholders and organizations. So maybe you can, you know, talk to us about where do you think right now is the readiness of organizations to comply with the AI draft regulation? Like, you know, how close are they to being able to comply? And what do you think is maybe the biggest challenges, you know, if there is a gap, for that gap to be closed?
Yeah, Cathy. In fact, that's a really big challenge, I should say, because today, what we can see as, let's say, bottleneck, because there are some bottlenecks. I mean, with the existing draft AI regulation, I believe that we need still, more work collectively to make it happen in an efficient way, because we can make it happen not in an efficient way. It's not our objective. But today, I believe there are two main points that we need our attention, I mean, from the collective perspective. The first one is about AI definition and scope of this, where we should apply this regulation, because there are plenty of AI definition, as you know. So on which kind of service, which kind of, algorithm should we apply the regulation or not? Because it depends on the definition. And we know that there are plenty of definition of AI. I will not go into, a statistical AI, a symbolic AI, optimization. Is it AI or not AI? Is it AI, or not? Or there is a wider definition where we can say that AI is whatever we make value from data. Each time we transform data into, information and knowledge, then it's AI. I mean, there are computer vision algorithms where not all the time there is a learning, but it happens. Anyway, so the first one is to have quite, let's say, a consensus in the international level, and from the regulation aspect, we need to have a reference definition of AI. The second one is about conformity assessment. This is really another story. So the readiness today, it is about really the accountability that, because we are talking about trust, but we need proof of trust. And the proof of trust, not all companies are ready for this proof of trust from this perspective, meaning when we have, for example, meaning that for accountability aspect, meaning responsibility, traceability on data lifecycle. I mean, today we need a very foundational work with regards to this traceability of data lifecycle, and all the data need to be reachable, findable, reusable, and of course, these are principles, but I'm not sure that all companies have this kind, of data models, so that ensure, the traceability of the life cycle, but in the same time, accountability with regards to algorithm, meaning having own tools that allow, the evaluation, the assessment, whether the algorithm is doing the right outcome. Does it behave like it is said in the README, for example, or in the, notice how it works? So, I mean, these kind of things are not deployed at a large scale. Today, what we can find, I mean, at least from the software perspective, software development perspective, we have some, references with regards to the quality of software development lifecycle, meaning into the design, into the development and the deployment. Certification, but it's not yet there, from the AI perspective. So today, there is still, I believe, room to make it happen, and the level of readiness is definitely not there yet, I believe, because of this, this auditability and this capacity to evaluate the behavior, not only of one algorithm and one model, but the whole AI system, which could be, a combination of different algorithm with different nature, internal, external. So that's why, when we talk about responsible AI from the industrial perspective, we need to be responsible, whatever, even if we include third-party, piece of software. So we need to ensure this global, responsibility. And I don't know whether we get back to the conformity assessment, because today there is no way of how to define very clearly in a very objective way what does it mean, conformity assessment, and how to reach this conformity assessment. Yeah.
No, that's great, and I think it's a really good overview of some of the kind of couple of the really key challenges. So, Alfredo, maybe I'll bring you into the conversation. One of the first challenges that Nozha brought up was defining what AI is. And when you think of how the regulation has been designed, having that definition of what's in scope and then being able to risk categorize it is really important. So, what are your thoughts in regards to that particular challenge? Is it something that you're feeling in your working with AI?
Cathy, this is I would say this is a tough question. It's one of the questions we have every day in front of our engineers, because most of them come from they come from the past, previous regulation, okay? So they have seen the AI and machine learning is an unregulated territory where they can really test and prove their experience and the capability to do innovation and invent the future, if you want. Okay, bringing them into the conversation about, let's classify what you guys are doing, let's take in account the implication of what you guys are doing in the social life and the decision. So the principle of accountability that Nozha was referring to, it has been very, very difficult. Most of them, and I want to provide as a feedback here, those guys sometimes are very young, and they feel there's like a again, the process is jumping to slow down my innovation pace. Okay, someone coming from an old guy like me is coming, imposing a change in the way we work, because they really underestimate the implication of what they're doing. So we have classified our products internally, not officially, not in a very strict way, following the category that has been provided by the regulation Europe in EU. Most of the product we are providing into the AI machine learning are into the limited kind of part, because we are providing mostly chatbot or these kind of things. But we have also something in the high risk level, because we are in the e-commerce space. We use a lot maps and the mapping of people and behavior and traceability of what the consumer are doing in their behavior to be a consumer, not to be a person. Okay, this is another element of things. So so once again, my feedback is what we produce in-house. It's I don't want to say quite simple, but it's something that is process-driven and need to be explained especially to the young team. Where I found quite difficult is I'm also receiving, I don't know how to say in a different way, OEM product, means product already predefined by third party that I'm including in my technology, okay? And so the evaluation of them is not yet there in terms of proof of trust or all the things that Nozha was referring to. This kind of things is quite difficult. So trace the entire value chain before me, because after me it's quite straightforward. What is happening before me, what I receive as an OEM, is quite difficult to trace in this moment. Yeah. I don't know if I answer to your question, yes, but pretty much the experience.
No, I think it was a great answer, and I really like that you brought up the broader challenge of the value chain. I do think that sometimes it isn't appreciated how much an AI system is really an ecosystem of not only component models or algorithm code that are embedded into the final model, but also the different sensors and the analytic engines that kind of power the AI system. All the data sources, all of those need to be taken kind of into consideration. Romain, maybe I'll bring you into the conversation. You certainly have, in your VC role, see a much broader spectrum of, different AI potential systems, different teams. I'm sure a lot of them are quite young, as Alfredo is experiencing as well. So, what can you add in regards to the challenge around, the scoping what AI is or isn't, and also the kind of categorization, and maybe you can even dig into a little bit about that prohibited category. I'm sure for a startup, having their model put into that prohibitive category basically shuts them down. What's your perspective in regards to whether it's really feasible to create that kind of red line?
Yeah, I'll start with a disclaimer because I will sound like I don't like this regulation. I think it's incomplete and falls short because of the complexity of the problem. But I'm super glad that there is a regulation being put in place, that Europe is leading from that perspective, because there are scary aspects we need to all be aware of. So that being said, now we can talk about especially the prohibited section. That one got me really started, because if you look at what is the definition, like manipulative, subliminal impact on the user, etc. If you look at this, by its exact definition, Facebook is going to be prohibited in Europe when this comes into force. Facebook is subliminal and manipulative, and it's using a lot of AI to lure to decide what we're reading, because they want to keep us on the screen, basically. It has nothing to do with keeping us informed. So what would we do? And all of the startups are basically in this context. Sometimes it may feel like it's something very innocent, like optimizing for marketing or advertising, or even the content of an e-commerce website, because we want to optimize for conversion, not for your own satisfaction, but just for the commercial conversion of your visit on the website. So is it manipulative? Absolutely, yes. And so what will startup do if they can't really decide in which bucket they fall? And by the way, those buckets are fairly fuzzy in terms of where you are, because I think you could always argue that a technology is in one bucket or the other, but there are very strict, huge differences in how you treat companies depending on which bucket you fall into, and in terms of how you implement this for startups. So startups usually don't like regulations. They always outsmart the regulations in some way, because they are agile, because they're smaller, so they don't bring the attention right away. And so they basically learn as they walk. And I can tell you, none of the startups that are pitching VCs at the moment talk about this. We may see startups that use this as a business opportunity, just like it was the case for GDPR, where because of the GDPR regulation, a lot of startups came up with ideas and solutions to help larger companies comply. So I'm sure we will see that kind of startups in the coming years. But for the AI first startups, right now they're not working on this. It will be a problem. I think the regulation, though, is asking the right questions, and it reflects to us on our responsibility as investors, the responsibility of the entrepreneurs that are putting AI on the market. So at least it will have this impact that people will start looking at how their system is interacting with the users. I think this is really the number one benefit I see from this. But practically, it will be very hard to follow for startups because it will remain fuzzy and costly.
Right. No, that's great perspective, Romain. And just to those on the webcast, I'm happy to interject your own questions to the panelists. So use the chat if you want to ask a direct question, and I'm happy to kind of interject it throughout the rest of the next half an hour. Maybe just pulling on something that you just finished talking about, Romain, is just how difficult it will be. Certainly startups are not even thinking about it at this point. Like, they really just want to get their functionality funded and out into the world. They're not even thinking about governance and controls. And I think to kind of tie it into the previous comment that Alfredo made about the third parties that are engaged and I think that a lot of more mature organizations are going to be licensing a lot more of these AI systems than building them in-house. They're going to be purchasing them from the startups that you're funding. And so, Romain, what do you think is the right model? Like, because, whenever I speak to a lot of startups and I start to bring up the conversation about governance and controls, they seem to indicate that it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the users of their systems. But the reality is that, if you don't start designing AI with this in mind, the users aren't going to have the capabilities they need in the system to be able to function it. So do you have, a perspective on, ownership and accountability over complying with the regulation?
I think there is an interesting angle in this. It's the regulation is really focusing on the impact of AI on the human. So it's right, it's freedom, etc. And in a way, it's very similar to what happened in the pharma industry or life science industry with drugs. And what the FDA is doing is they've put in place steps for startups or even big firms to follow that gives them the right to put a drug on the market. And this is really well defined. Clinical trials in phase 1, 2, 3, you have documentation, etc. There is a playbook. I think there should be a similar playbook for any organization, starting with startups. I think we talked about the money invested right now, so that's becoming a big portion of the research in this domain. I think if there were a playbook, like what is EU expecting in terms of steps that need to qualify the interaction between an AI and a person? How do we quantify if it's, or qualify if it's subliminal, manipulative, etc.? How do we qualify the transparency of a system? It's super difficult, especially in the case of some of the more complex AI techniques like deep learning that by design are not transparent and actually work because they are not transparent. How do we supervise by a human? By design, most of the AI is here to automate stuff and automate it much faster than a human can even supervise. Otherwise, there's no point. And it's about reducing costs, helping people do something else. So if we keep people supervising an AI, we're not reducing costs at all. So what is the advantage? So I think there's the intent is great, but we're missing very clear guidelines on what is going to be required by a startup to demonstrate not only in which bucket they fall, but what are the interactions with the human and the precautions that need to be taken in the design phase and in the run-up phase when the AI is deployed. And today, because there are no guidelines, I'm pretty sure that startups will do with every new regulation, they will say, we don't care for now. We'll just develop our things, deploy. If we start making money commercially, we can start thinking about these questions. And if regulators start knocking at our door, then we'll think about it. I think I'd like to be more proactive with some of our startups and give them the playbook, but it has to be built.
Right. Well, thank you. That's a really interesting and perspective, because I think a lot of the conversation tends to focus on the more mature organizations. And I think we have to remember that there's that whole startup, group that we have to be thinking about as well. Nozha, maybe I'll kind of bring you into the conversation again. Romain brought it up, and you had brought it up as well, as to the need for the traceability and the explainability of the systems. And I think that's on top of probably bias and fairness. That's probably whether it's the first or second, they kind of tend to compete for priority. The two biggest challenges that a lot of organizations speak about in regards to, managing the risks of AI. What's your perspective in regards to maybe building on your earlier comment, what do we have to do in order to kind of get to being able to meet the requirements of the standard? Do we need more academic focus in this area? Do we need more partnerships between public, corporate? What do you think is maybe some of the fixes that you've maybe contemplated in your different conversations?
Yeah, definitely. We need more public-private partnership in this area, because some of the AI ethics principle are doable today. Some of them are yet still difficult to achieve. But definitely we need to have a really very clear, glossary of these terminology, because here I feel like we are confusing between explainability and transparency. To me, it is really two different things. I would prefer to talk about interpretability, because what we need, to be responsible, we don't care how the algorithm or how the deep learning is updating its own coefficient. Really, we don't care, okay? What we need to know is, with regards to a given input, what is the status of the output, in fact? And sometimes we talk a lot about black boxes, very popular, concept about black boxes. Yeah, black or white box, what is needed is to understand the whole, behavior of the whole system, meaning the interpretability. Are we capable, to have this traceability, or have at least, that's why today we have two approaches to ensure, and to reach the conformity assessment, which is not yet very clear and not standard, let's say. There is no standards for that. And it will be applicable when we will reach, certification in a measurable way, meaning then at that time you can build standards. But today we have this auditability framework, meaning we can evaluate the behavior, but where we can build public-private partnership is about new approaches, about value by design, a new machine learning algorithm, where it is really on the top of the research community result, and meaning that the idea is, of course, to build a new generation of AI algorithms that are value by, fairness by design, equity by design, these kind of things. And it happens that to make it possible, we need a new mathematical model to make it happen. So that's why there is a room really for this, public-private partnership, which is for these perspective, very, very important. And I would, in fact, comment very quickly on, indeed, what we have today is quite, weak definition between different risk levels. So it could be, we can have some issues in how to switch between a level and the next level, for example, in terms of risk. So yeah, this is real. But in more general perspective, I will not say that each recommender system is, we need to make it, to stop each recommender system. It's not the technology which is regulated, it's the impact of the technology, meaning, digital marketing, etc., through, recommender system, targeted this and this and this. Of course, we can continue to make it. Otherwise, we stop innovation and we stop new services, and it's not, it's not acceptable. And I'm not sure that, I'm even sure that it's not the purpose of the European Commission to make it this way. But it is more about, recommender system. What's the impact? Is it something that we can manage? The customer or the citizen can change his mind and can, it is, even if he's not at the end happy, he can change his decision. But in some cases, there is harmful, impacts, and only the harmful impact are regulated, not the technology. So that's why I'm not sure that a lot of companies will be prohibited, but it is more about, the technology, it's more the impact that would be, this is my understanding, at least today. Yeah, it's more the, the application context and not the technology that is prohibited. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting debate that's been happening around regulations as to, what do you regulate, right? Do you regulate, the use case, the context, or do you regulate the technology, like facial recognition, for example, right? So, I think that to me, it seems like everyone's kind of starting to kind of move away from regulating the technology, realizing that, a tool is a tool, right? So what you do with that tool is what's important. A hammer can put in a nail as much as it can hit someone's thumb. So, we do need to kind of, recognize that. Maybe Alfredo, I'll bring you back into the conversation. When you think about your organization and, needing to think about complying with the regulation, this current one or a future one, what do you feel is the, if you had a magic genie, what would you think would be something that you would need so you would really feel comfortable going to bed at night that you have developed and produced and are operating responsible AI? Like, what do you think are maybe some of the control or governance practices that you don't currently have today that you would like to have, or do you feel that you've already been able to kind of, at least for the AI that you're currently developing, that what you've got is appropriate?
Yeah. Well, basically, chatting with my engineers of my engineering team, developing the AI and machine learning, definitely going back to my previous, the previous conversation, what I really need today is build something related to the traceability of what is coming in the value chain. This is very, very needed in this moment because most of the solutions we are developing are multi-cloud. Are coming from different, the source is coming from different providers, and we have a different element of compliances that we need to comply with. Not just the trust and accountability of the algorithm itself, but even the data is a problem sometimes. Decide if a data is a trust data, I can use the data. Data is not being, affected by transformation that is not edit transformation. Is something that my team every day is considering when we're using this data. But what we're trying to do, and I'm a little bit dreaming now, there is a portion of my center of excellence that is trying to develop an algorithm to trace the, give like a weight to the algorithm in terms of number of attributes related to bias. So we would like to try to score the algorithm based on the number of attributes that can bring bias, okay? Mm-hmm. That is an element. It's not the regulation, it's an element of the evaluation of the algorithm. So I'm having a couple of guys that are using mathematical approach, trying to score the algorithm and come back with an element and say, this algorithm score in a range between 0 to 5, score 2 in terms of bias from our standpoint. And this at least generate conversation within the engineering team to go deeper and understanding exactly if the algorithm is correct. So, so basically, this is where my team is working right now, but I'm very worried every day. In the past of my career, when I was working in a different engineering team, I was worried about intellectual properties. That no one in my engineering team was using someone else's intellectual properties to give me back algorithm. Sometimes when you put pressure, engineers copy what someone else is doing is the fastest path, okay? Yeah. In this case, I'm really worried about taking data that is not ethics or has been manipulated not in the right way. Or most important, is not coming from places, nation, or outside the European Union without control. And this is every day like, it's a moment where every day we have a conversation, we have a review about our data lakes and the source of data.
Right. Maybe let me just kind of dig a little bit deeper, because one of the key I'll call control mechanisms in the regulation right now is the conformity assessment. A lot of people might have seen something equivalent like in a privacy impact assessment. But my concern always is when you come with some kind of assessment, it becomes a prescribed kind of checklist. And with AI, with the how early it is still in its development, but also just how broad its use cases are, and just how we're still learning about all the risks and ramifications. Like have you had any best practices within your organization, or do you foresee putting, maybe thinking some that you've heard that could actually help to, create some more, thoughtful, approaches to AI. So not just approaching the conformity assessment as a checklist, but really trying to kind of have a thoughtful application of the conformity, I guess, objectives.
It's for me, Cathy?
Yes, yeah.
Well, honestly, we don't have a lot of experience in applying the assessment right now, okay? But what we're trying to do, we are trying to extend our compliance assessment model, as you point correctly, where it's not just a checklist, we have another element. We're trying to suggest remediation. And the remediation is a way to see if we're going in the right direction. So it's not just check and see if we are complying with a single element, but also, if not, trying to suggest a remediation of that. And having a conversation with the customer or internally to check if the remediation meet with the compliance rule. But to your point, we're not using the assessment in an extensive way so well that I can, have experience to share in this moment with the rest of the audience. We're trying to adjust what we already do in the typical compliance way into the AI machine learning.
No, thank you. Nozha, do you have maybe a thought perspective as well on the conformity assessments? And
yeah, in fact, we started with really the foundational work. When we talk about fairness, for example, indeed, I fully okay with the comments in chat. We need to analyze data before feeding algorithm, how data are diverse, etc. If they are not diverse, we need to look for other data sources. But before going into that, we need, first of all, to check the robustness, meaning reproducibility, repeatability, because same algorithm, same system, in the same context and condition, if it's not repeatable, neither reproducible, it will not lead to, similar outcomes for the same conditions. And this is the definition of discrimination, meaning having different outcomes for a really very similar context. So this is, discrimination without having intent to discrimination. So that's why before going far away to analyze fairness, we need, first of all, to really set up robust algorithm, robust AI system. And that's, really the basics before, analyzing whatever in terms of components, in terms of data, because of course, the biases and fairness, we have data bias and algorithmic bias. We need to tackle both. And from, so for us, we are starting this kind of, foundational work, really framework, but also model observability, data observability, frameworks, because this will allow us to have measurable, ways to check whether we are aligned to the ethical principle or not. Because I fully agree, checklists are maybe a first step, but could not, lead to conformity assessment, as the checklists are not comparable, neither, we cannot lead us to standards.
Right. No, thank you. That's a really important and perspective, and I really appreciate both yours and Alfredo's comments on it. Maybe I'll just kind of take a bit of a pause and see if there's any of the participants that want to come off mute and ask a question directly to our panelists. I know there's been a couple of chat comments around data sovereignty and the importance of data. So I will jump into that if I don't get any other questions, but just want to check to see if there's any burning question out in the group.
I think, Cathy, there is a question in the chat as well, and if I don't, some question in the chat.
Maybe this is Charles, maybe I'll just be bold enough. I was interested, Romain, in your comment early on that the category, or one of the categories of prohibited AI is so broad that even, you know, popular apps that are used by so many people will be potentially made illegal, and that the startup community won't have any idea as to whether they, you know, their product is going to be simply prohibited someday. The counterpoint that I've actually heard quite a bit is that the definition, the prohibited AI categories have been very, very narrowly defined. And the suggestion is that they, you know, they simply, there'll be very few use cases where they would apply. And just to sort of drill down on that, the idea that, you know, AI systems that have a subliminal aspect to them will be captured. If you look at the test, it's not just that they're subliminal, it's that they're subliminal in a way that is unconscious to the user and that is likely to create material, physical, or psychological harm to that individual. And that's a very, it's a very strong series of tests that are going to have to be applied. And I guess where my question is going is the definition is really focused on the harm that a subliminal system would cause to one individual. And I'm wondering whether, you know, the various examples that we've seen in society that have been of concern is really about the cumulative effect on a community. You know, if you look at misinformation and anti-democratic misinformation, it's really about the effect on a broad group of people, the cumulative effect, rather than the negative impact on a single individual. So just wanted to get your sort of reaction to that comment.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think this definition is both extremely precise and also very subjective, in my opinion, because how do you assess, especially when you start at small scale, how do you assess the manipulative nature of an algorithm? You would need to test across a variety of population, because maybe it will work perfectly for adults, not for teens, great for women, not for men, etc. I mean, there's a whole variety of subjective reactions that may be caused by this algorithm. It's virtually impossible to test. And so I still think that by the definition I'm looking at, Facebook would fall on the wrong side of the line. Now, if we look at the opposite, I think something we said during the call is really important, is to focus on the impact on the human. In the end, it's all that matters. And that is actually triggering me an interesting question. If there are algorithms that are extremely performant, also extremely complex to understand, not really easy to look into, and sometimes even the mechanism with which they've been tuned is not replicable. We just end up with something that works. We know in practice it works. We can't prove in theory that it works, and we can't really reproduce the path to make it work right, but it works. Imagine you have something that can predict cancer with 99% accuracy, where a doctor would predict at 90% accuracy. By the definition of regulation, because we can't prove how it operates, we can't have human oversight and a number of things, we should not be using that algorithm. But in the end, it's good for the humans. So I agree this is the right angle, but again, it's not going to be easy. It's not as easy as what the FDA came up with for drugs, which is if it works for more than 51% of the population on the test sample, I'm authorizing this drug. But we'll need to come up with something more precise. And again, it goes completely in the right direction. I think for the first time, the creators of AI will have to ask themselves the question on what is going to happen at scale in the mind and in the bodies of the users that will be subject to that AI. That's a great question.
Romain, may I add a comment?
Yes, go ahead, Alfredo.
Yeah, and it's more than a comment. It's one of the fundamental questions that every day we have with our engineering team that I want to pose to you as well. This regulation is related to AI and machine learning algorithm. It's not related to the end user application. So the question that my engineers are giving me is, Facebook, is an example, but we can name any other, okay? I don't want to put particular attention on something. Is a behavior, is an application. Behind the scene, you have several AI and machine learning algorithms that work together to provide behavior. Regulation is focused on what? On the single algorithm, or is focused on the results of everything, where it's not just machine learning and AI, but it's more than that. So the effect on people is the application, or is the algorithm behind the scene? And how can I define the boundary between the two? My technical team is challenging me, say, I just made an algorithm that is taking decisions about the price of the house in a certain area of the city. What I'm not doing, I'm not creating an application that forces people to go there or buy an house. So this is a fundamental question. And honestly, I don't know the answer. I could stay with my engineering view rather than my sociological view, if you want. Yeah, that is different. Again, it's not an answer, but it's a conversation that I have every day with my team. I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's a really interesting addition, Alfredo. And I think what it does is it really brings to the fore that many different debates that this regulation is creating. This is one of them. We've talked about a couple of others. Unfortunately, our hour has flown by. Like, this has been such a great conversation, and I wish we had another hour to dig into these conversations. But I hate to kind of put it on our presenters, but maybe we've got 30 seconds to 45 seconds for each of you, maybe to give just your one, burning point that you'd maybe want to kind of leave the presenters with. So maybe Alfredo, you've got the floor right now. Maybe if you want to start.
I go in 10 seconds. So it's great to have a regulation, but our job, our activity every day is to balance between business regulation and people. And this is going to be really the challenge we have in front of us in the next, couple of years, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. But, as Romain said earlier, it's great to have something on paper, to have a starting regulation to start responding to. But I think there's still a lot of work to come. Nozha, do you want to go next?
Yeah, in fact, indeed, there are still plenty of questions. In fact, our intent at Ingka is really to develop responsible technology, and that's it. I mean, it's beyond compliance what we would like to offer to our customer. It's more transparent, services, and transparency doesn't mean explainability, but it means providing, a lot of information so that the consumer feel comfortable when he takes or she takes a decision. It's more about informing what's behind the scene, why this and why that, and in terms of recommender, in terms of this and this and this, providing plenty of information. And we also, we are building the customer data promise, providing user control, beyond compliance for the user data. So that's why we are more oriented into responsible data and technology use and deployment, because I believe we still need application decree for this draft.
Right. Yes, thank you. And I think it really is important having that linkage between the technology and the data. One cannot be evaluated without the other. So Romain, why don't you take us home and kind of give us your parting thought?
Yeah, no, we should not waste this opportunity to all reflect within our organizations about the purpose, the raison d'être of technology and AI in particular. And to do this, it starts with education, because everybody needs to reach the same level of understanding of what we're talking about, even the general public. And something I'm throwing out there, maybe a crazy idea, but there is a system for energy consumption for homes, for cars, for appliances like A, B, C, D, E. You already know when you buy something, you know exactly if it's harmful or not for the planet. It would be great tomorrow that any system, whether virtual or physical, that it contains AI, has a grading system from A to E, from very harmful, like be very careful, to AI inside, but really sympathetic to humans, for example.
Yeah, great suggestion, Romain. And I think there's, I've seen a couple of groups that are starting to think along that same line. So maybe it'll come come in the future. So thank you everyone for participating. Our panelists, this has been a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate the time that you brought and the different perspectives. And we will be having a recording this put up on the Human Technology Foundation's website. So if you've got other colleagues that you think will be helpful to listen to this, we'll have that available to you. And thank you again to the Human Technology Foundation and iTech Law and McCarthy's, which Charles is here to represent those last two, and myself from EY. Thank you again for joining us today. And the conversation has just started. There'll be many more to come. So thank you. Have a good afternoon and good morning to everyone.